Hey everyone, so welcome to another video. In this video I want to talk about the Sämisch variation of the King's Indian defense, specifically for the white pieces. And this is more of an introduction video. So I'm going to show you two model games by white, some improvements along the way, and hopefully I'm guessing if you're under 2000 or 1800, this video is going to be quite useful if you are kind of confused on what to play against the King's Indian defense, if you are, again, like a 1d4 player. So yeah, I want to show you these two games, and we're going to go into a lot more detail in the next video where I actually talk about the theory in this variation. A couple of people also commented that they wanted to know, this variation, this Sämisch King's Indian for the black pieces. So I will take a more two-sided approach and talk about the most challenging options, because I don't think that black is like lost out of the opening or anything. So yeah, I definitely want to stay objective and give you some points about this opening for both sides, and we're going to be looking into that in the next video. So yeah, in the first game we see this, we're going to follow this game played by Andreas Kelires, I think Greek Grandmaster, against Fabian Benziger, who is a Swedish international master. So the game starts out with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, and here already we see that there's an important distinction. White either needs to play the move knight c3. White has options of knight c3, knight f3, or playing a move like g3, which is quite common to enter the Catalan. I mean, like get a Catalan approach against black's fianchetto setup, and typically this transposes to like a fianchetto variation of the King's Indian. But also in here, it's important to know that if you play the move knight c3, it does allow the move pawn to d5, entering the main line, a Grunfeld defense. Meanwhile, if you play knight f3, the immediate d5 is not as good because you'll simply take, and either knight takes d5 will be met with e4, or queen takes d5 will be met with knight c3. So this is quite good for white. And so after here, bishop g7, and if you play knight c3 now, then of course black can again play d5. But typically if they want to castle e4 and go for d6, then we essentially enter the mainline King's Indian with the knight on f3, meaning that we no longer have the option of putting a pawn on f3. And so if we compare that with the move knight c3, of course, it does allow the Grunfeld defense, which you need to know something against. But after bishop g7, e4, d6, and now white plays f3. And so this f3 move is the trademark Sämisch variation of the King's Indian. And the point is that since white does not commit the knight to f3, they can develop the knight to e2, and then maybe it can go to g3 to advance or to support this h4, h5 plan. The typical development scheme that white goes for is to go for bishop e3, queen to d2, knight g to e2 to g3 again, so that it can prepare h4, h5, and then white will decide if they want to castle long or castle short. Now, if white castles long, then they're going to need to be very careful about black opening up the queen side really quickly with a6, b5, which is why in a lot of variations, white actually castles short and just maintains control over the position. So something I like about this variation is that it ensures that you're going to get more space in the opening. So and also, like, a lot of the typical King's Indian complications with black attacking on the king side while white breaking through on the queen side doesn't really happen. It doesn't really it normally isn't as threatening as in the main line. So yeah, if you don't like to be attacked, then this is a great variation to choose. And so from here, after f3, black normally castles, and now there's an option. You can go for bishop g5, which is completely fine, or they move bishop e3, which is the main line. And from this position, there are a lot of moves. Black can play e5, they can play c5, they can play knight c6, or they can play a move like a6 here. Now, a6 is interesting, but we're going to look into this variation in the next video, where essentially black can also hope to gambit the pawn with b5, or advance with c6 and the b5. They can also enter the Panno variation, which is notably after the move either a6 or knight c6. Generally, the point of black's play is that they want to advance with a6, let's just say knight g2, and then a6, trying to go for b5 here. And oftentimes they prepared this with rook b8, bishop d7, and then b5. So the point is just to play on get some play on the queen side there. But in the next game, we're going to be looking at this variation more in depth. Interesting is also this move a6, which has the intention of actually playing b5 immediately. And this is also a good gambit for black, and it manages to equalize, but I think that white has some practical things to play for here. So yeah, well, we're gonna look into that variation in the next video. But in this video, I want to talk about this move c5, which is played in this game. And now the point is that this is a pawn sacrifice first off. But if you take on c5, then at the end of the day, white does win a pawn. But black is known to get very good compensation here with a move like knight d4, potentially trading off a set of pieces here, and later winning the bishop pair. And this bishop is also on this diagonal, which is quite strong. So yeah, we're gonna also look into that because this is definitely playable. And if black isn't prepared, then they are at a great risk of just being down a pawn for no compensation. So they do need to know some stuff there. And from here, the best move is to play the move knight g2. Now the point is that if you want to play the space gaining d5, then because the knight is not on c6, it means that we don't really kick this knight away, and the knight can often go to d7. So what we essentially get is just a Benoni structure. This bishop is nicely put on this diagonal, and black can immediately challenge the center with e6. So let's say e6, queen d2, takes, a6, very typical Benoni counterplay, trying to advance at b5. So white prevents that with a4, and then rook e8. And black is known to have quite good pressure on the e-file and can later put a knight on e5, maybe knight bd7 to e5, maybe c4, and overall this position is known to be fine. Which is why white normally plays the move knight e2. And from this variation, c takes d4 is possible, but we'll just get a very nice Maroczy bind setup with this pawn on c4 and e4, restricting black's central breaks. These are the two typical breaks that black wants to go for, but it's not really possible here. So instead, knight c6 is best, or one of the options is the main line actually, and white plays the move d5. So now that the knight is on c6, we kick it away so that we maintain good control over the center. And the point that black is making is that once they put the knight on e5, since they are like converging on this g4 square, we can never really push f4 here because oftentimes the knight goes to g4, and also they're attacking the c4 pawn. So here white should play the move knight g3. And again, like the point of this is to go for h4, h5, but also defending the c4 pawn. One idea is that also if you want to kick this knight away, is that we play the move h3 first so that we can push f4 and not allow a piece to occupy the g4 square. So that's an idea. And so here, black normally plays the move e6, trying to chip down away at white's center, try to open up the e-file, and now bishop e2. So white doesn't really want to castle long because if they do so, then possibly the queen side is going to open up with even a strong pawn sacrifice here. So we just want to get castled. And okay, black can take here on d5, which is the main line, but typically black goes for this move h5 anyways, which will transpose into the game after h5. And the point of h5 is to prepare some ideas of pawn to h4 to try to mislodge this knight. And also, it has ideas of bringing this knight to h7 so that it can actually open up this bishop's diagonal and also free up the f pawn to be able to advance and try to open up the f file. So this is a very typical move. But here, it's actually nice that white has a very strong move, castling. And this really shows great understanding that the move pawn to h4 isn't really good for black, because after h4 and knight h1, it looks kind of weird that this knight is on h1. But the point is that this knight has good prospects on f2, so that it can both defend the e4 pawn and cover the g4 square. So, for example, if black continues with h3 here, white has the very strong move g4, and suddenly the h3 pawn can fall very easily, as well as white having some ideas of f4 to kick away the knight. So this is quite nice. But in this game, black played a6, trying to take on d5, and then play b5. So in the spirit of the Sämisch and trying to limit black's counterplay, white should play a4, very typical. And here, black took on d5. Sooner or later, they're going to have to play this move, c takes d5, and now knight h7. This is one of the ideas that I mentioned. It opens up the f file and also has ideas even of g5, without dropping the h pawn. And so here queen d2. So white connects the rooks and prepares to bring the rook to e1. After rook e8, white plays a strong move knight h1, and it's oftentimes possible. We need to know some strategic things about this position. So a move like bishop h6 is possible. To exchange this kind of good bishop, looking down at this diagonal. But at the same time, we don't really want to exchange too many pieces because we want to go for the attack here. And with more pieces on the board, it's going to be easier for us to do that. So knight h1 is a nice move. So even without the h-pawn advancing, white voluntarily brings the knight to f2. And after h4, knight f2, just simply defending the e4 pawn, and now f5. Again, this is one of the main ideas to get counterplay. And from this position, we see that as a result of f5, this structure has kind of been weakened, and so the blacking is a bit weak. And so in this game, white played the very strong move king h1 with the intention of getting out of the g-file so that the rook can occupy the g-file, and later white has ideas of playing a move like rook g1 and then g3 to just play on the g-file. So yeah, like this is quite a nice position for white. And from here there are a lot of reasonable moves like rook b8, you know, followed by bishop d7 trying to push b5, or a move like knight f7 just to open up the bishop's diagonal. But in this game, black played the move queen e7, which is probably not best because the queen doesn't really do much on the e-file. It maybe puts some pressure on like some of the pieces on the e-file here, but the e-file's not opening up yeah, a lot, and black is not really doing much with queen e7. So here white just continues with rook a to e1. And white has a nice center, and potentially one idea to go for is to go for h3 and then advance with f4, or even just take on f5 and let's take a knight on e4. That's another idea. And so here black decided to play h3, which is kind of a desperate move because they want to try to muddy the waters, and it's understandable from the King's Indian point of view that you want to imbalance the position and get counterplay that way. But here, because we know that the g-file is actually an asset that white can use, this move just simply opens up the h-file, the g-file after knight takes h3, f takes e4, and now knight takes e4. So white could take on e4 with the pawn, but that would leave a weakness on e4. For example, this pawn may be weak, and a target for later, the queen and the rook. So knight takes e4 is also nice because it activates the knight to an active square. And after bishop takes h3, g takes h3, and pawn to b5, this is black's point. They managed to get the b5 break in, because if we take on b5 twice, ideas of knight takes f3 are possible here, because the knight on e4 is being undermined. So that's kind of not great. And so in the game, knight g3 was played. A strong move actually would have been, an improvement would have been queen c2, which is kind of an unusual move, but it targets the g6 pawn potentially. And after b takes a4, white can play f4. So the point is that the e4 knight is defended once, and so a move like knight c4 doesn't really do much. You know, you can take on c4 here with either piece. And so after f4, yeah, black has to play a move like knight f7, but now bishop d3, and just like targeting the pawn at g6, white has a very nice position. But instead, knight g3 was played, intending f4 without weakening the knight on e4. And here, black played knight f7, very typical. Now bishop d3, targeting g6, and now queen f6. So just defending the pawn, and also hitting b2. Now, white played a very practical move, which I like in this position, which is knight e4. The point is that probably best is to play b3 just to keep everything solid and still maintaining a nice advantage. But knight e4 has the intention that if black takes on b2, then white can trade and then take on b5, where there's simply going to be up a pawn. And even though this is not as good as the variation with b3 in this position, I think that is very practical because black doesn't want to enter an endgame just down a pawn. They want to, you know, typically they want to keep the pieces on the board so they can complicate things. And so they play the move queen h4. But this is just bad because white plays queen g2, targeting g6. So black plays knight f8, and we see that this knight is kind of just only doing one task, which is to defend the pawn. And now rook g1, putting more pressure, rook a to b8, and seeing that the b2 pawn may be a weakness if the b file opens up, white takes on b5 and closes up the b file. And here, best would have probably been to play the move f4, just to control the e5 square, preventing a piece from occupying e5. But knight f2 was played, opening up an attack against... Oops, sorry about that. Had Siri playing. And the intention of knight f2 is obviously just to attack g6. And so the thing is that after knight e5, white can play a move like bishop e4, just keeping everything very solid and still keeping, you know, a pawn up, a nice advantage. But instead bishop e5 was played, which immediately just allowed bishop takes g6 on the spot. This is even faster than what happened in the game. In the game, a move like bishop e4 is played, but you see that white maintained like good control over the position, and eventually managed to win, even though they blundered like just 2 moves later. But yeah, that was not a result of the opening. That was just like a misstep and just something missed. But yeah, we see after bishop takes g6, this is just like completely crushing. Let's say takes, king f8, then f4, just to kick the bishop away. The computer already recommends a move like queen f6, which just loses the bishop. So bishop takes f4 is probably what makes sense, but after bishop takes f4, there's a mating threat on g7, and this is just decisive. So yeah, essentially that's all I want to show from this game from an opening point of view, is that white got a really good position that they managed to squeeze black in, and because of the pressure and the feeling that they needed to imbalance the position, they suddenly lost very quickly. So yeah, the next game we're going to look at is a game by Igor Kovalenko against Ilya Smirin, Israeli grandmaster, and one who is a big exponent, one of the biggest exponents of the King's Indian in the world. Yeah, very strong player, and this was played in 2019. So we entered the Sämisch King's Indian after bishop e74 and then f3 in this position. After castles, bishop e3, and now a6. So a6 is a bit of a mysterious move because it can both threaten multiple systems with either the pawn sacrifice on b5, or advancing with c6 and the b5, or going with the Panno variation, which is the move after knight g2 to go knight c6. And this is the big variation that was popular back in like the 80s and even before that, long before that. And yeah, the intention again is to go for rook b8, try to advance with b5, and go for bishop d7 to defend to even control the b5 square further. And so here, white needs to play in a very specific way. The thing is that they don't want to move this knight to g3 so early, because oftentimes the knight can actually go to c1 and then later go to either b3 or d3. More often it goes to b3, so that it can play on the queen side. And this is the thing about the Sämisch variation, is that it's very flexible and it depends on what setup the black is going to go for and how black is going to generate counterplay. And so here, after queen d2, white just develops the queen. This is a move that we want to make. Black plays rook b8, preparing b5, and seeing that b5 is going to be played, white can play the move rook c1, a very nice prophylactic move, just to prevent b5 at this moment, because b5 is not possible on a kind of takes, and then since the knight of c6 is loose, just knight takes b5 wins a pawn. So here bishop d7 is best just to defend the knight, and then to prepare b5 next. And historically, the main move has been the move knight d1. And this has good chances to prove an advantage. For example, after b5, the main idea that of white bring the knight to d1, besides the fact that it's going to f2 that we saw in the previous variation and the previous game, is that the knight is useful to defend the e4 pawn, but also it opens up the c file. So this move c5 is possible, just essentially closing down the c file and stopping black's counterplay on the b file. And this is known to be quite nice for white. But in this video and in this series, essentially, I want to, if and when possible, I want to recommend a move that is not the main move and has some, and is objectively equal or even better than the main line. So in this position, I want to recommend the move h4, which has, it caught my attention because it has a ridiculously high win rate. And this game by Kovalenko really shows a model execution of this idea. Now, the idea is that h4 kind of provokes h5 because it's essentially necessary. If black plays a move like b5 here, trying to get some counterplay, then we can still continue with h5. And let's say they play b4, then oftentimes we can bring the knight to d5, where if the knight on f6 is removed, then another, then a piece is, a defender of the king's side is removed, and so this is quite nice. And let's say if knight takes h5, then we can either continue with g4 or bishop h6 first. Let's just say g4, knight f6, and now bishop h6. And again, if they play b4 or b takes e4, a move like knight d5 is just deadly. Let's just say takes, check, king g8, and then knight d5. And this is just winning. So yeah, that's not really possible, and which is why this idea of h4 is really nice. And so black is forced to play h5 here. And after knight d1, going for the similar idea, this inclusion of h4, h5 is quite nice, and it doesn't harm white's position at all. So here, if black plays the move b5, then of course, the thematic move is to play the move c5, and preparing to recapture on c5 with the rook so that it puts pressure on the c file. Instead, e5 was played in this game, and after d5, just closing up the center, knight e7, white plays knight f2. And the point is that, again, b5, this is most common, but white plays c5, and there's a dangerous threat of playing c6 here, which just shuts down all of black's counterplay on the queen side and really asks black, what are these pieces doing, like on the queen side here? So black is essentially forced to take here. But after bishop takes c5, like, it's clear that white has a nice position. They can play moves like rook d1 to put pressure on the d file, and then free up the c1 square for the knight to go later to b3, maybe go to a5 if needed. And either way, the knight is just nice on either b3 or d3. Generally, I think b3 makes more sense. But here knight e7 was played, which is good judgment by black, saying that, okay, like, b5 doesn't really work, so I'm gonna try to generate some counterplay with f5. Sorry, pawn to f5 here. And so here c5. So white achieves the typical King's Indian break and is managing to chip away at this d6 pawn. And black played the move f5, and white played the move queen b4. So e4 is nicely defended. If f takes e4, which is played in the game, then this is, I think, already inaccurate, because white plays the move f takes e4, and this pawn, like, without any tension available on the position, it's like black doesn't really achieve much from this captures. Best is probably just to take on c5, but obviously, like, white is better here. They can bring the knight to c3 to further defend the e4 pawn, bring the knight to d3, bishop e2, and just get a nice position. And just get, we have a lot of space, more control over the position. It's all just very nice. But instead, f takes e4 was played, and this shows that, yeah, another problem of this exchange is that besides the fact that it releases the tension, it allows the occupation of the f3 square. So white can later, we can see, use a clever maneuver to improve their pieces. So here again, best is probably to take on c5, but as we saw before, this is quite a nice variation. Instead, rook f6 was played, but now after c takes d6, and c takes d6, this pawn on d6 is just a big weakness, and so white plays the very nice move, knight g1, and we see that this is another downside of playing the early takes on e4, just improving itself to f3 so that it can go on g5. And we see that a problem in general, when black plays the move e5 in the King's Indian, is that this bishop is just very bad. Unless it's able to exchange itself on h6, for example, for white's dark sword bishop, then this bishop is typically quite a bad piece, and we don't want to exchange it. So black plays b5 here, trying to generate some counterplay, getting the pawn out of danger as well. But now bishop e2, just developing rook c8, and black is hoping that the exchange of queens kind of eases their task, but that's not really the case. After white takes on c8, knight takes c8, okay, queen takes c8 doesn't really threaten anything. White can just continue with knight f3, and the queen doesn't really, can't really infiltrate, besides c2, but it can easily be kicked away with a move like bishop d3. So instead, knight takes c8 was chosen, but now knight f3, and white just has a dominating position here. Rook f7 was played, and now queen d2, just nicely converging on the g5 square, preparing to put a piece there. So after bishop f6, white plays a nice move, knight g5, and after takes, and bishop g7, we can see that all of black's pieces are just stuck on the first two ranks. And yeah, just white has a dominating space advantage here. And here, white played a very instructive move. So what we want to go for is try to go for this g4 idea. And we see that even if the king is like right dead in the center, it's like not even a problem, because the bishop on e3 is nicely holding everything together. And so this g4 move is kind of what we want to play. But the problem is that black can play this move h4. And the point is that after rook takes h4, at least black has restricted one of white pieces from occupying the g4 square. And so this is, much still better for white, but it's not the best move in the position. The best move, which is played in the game, was the move rook h4. Just fixing the h-pawn so that it can't move, and next is pawn to g4 to blast open the king side. And now after bishop e8, trying to defend g6, white just breaks with g4. And if you take on g4, then a piece is going to occupy the g4 square. And so this is dangerous. So rook c7 was played, just trying to give up a pawn. But after takes, white wants to not only win this pawn, but get the ideal placement of their pieces. So they play queen d1, so that later after they take on h5, if the bishop takes, the queen can enter in, and this becomes like a decisive attack. And so knight e7 was played, but now bishop takes h5, rook c8 was played. Now bishop g4, trying to infiltrate on e6. And now knight g6 was played, hitting the rook, bishop e6 check, bishop f7, and white plays another nice move, queen h5, making use of the tactics here, so that the h4 rook is not able to be captured because of this sequence, and this will soon lead to mate. And instead bishop takes e6 was played, but now queen takes g6, bishop d7 was played, and now queen to h7, rook f8, and another nice move, a very nice move, rook h1. And this is just a masterclass of a Sämisch King's Indian, with the rook coming to f1 and just delivering checkmate very soon. So here black played the desperate queen a5 check. After bishop d2, they played rook c1, making use of the bishop's pin, but after knight d1, there's simply a fork on these two pieces, as well as rook f1 coming. Black simply resigned in the position. So a beautiful game here by Kovalenko, and something that I hope would be useful for players under 2000, especially just to look at this, a lot of the common themes in this variation, and how to kind of squeeze black with this variation. And this is especially useful for positional players who don't mind a small advantage, because oftentimes it won't be like a knockout win like this. Oftentimes it will just be like a slow increase of like tiny advantages. And so yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you like the video, please like, subscribe, and do comment anything that you think of this variation. If you have any insights, if you have any suggestions for future videos, please also comment those down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.